The studio was warm, the audience was laughing, and Audrey Hepburn was doing what she had always done, holding herself together with absolute grace. She sat across from Johnny Carson in a pale ivory dress, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect, her smile exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything looked fine. Everything looked the way Audrey always made things look: effortless, composed, untouchable. Then Carson leaned forward, lowered his voice just slightly, and said 7 words. No one heard them clearly. The boom microphone caught only fragments. But the audience watched what those 7 words did to a woman who had survived the Nazi occupation of Holland as a child, who had buried 2 marriages in silence, who had never, not once in 40 years of public life, allowed herself to break down on camera. Her smile disappeared first. Then her shoulders dropped, almost imperceptibly, the way a wall crumbles before it falls. Her eyes filled with tears she clearly hadn't planned on, and for a long moment she simply looked at Johnny Carson with an expression that didn't belong to Audrey Hepburn the actress or Audrey Hepburn the icon. It belonged to someone much older and much more tired than the woman the world thought it knew. For a moment, no one moved. The audience of 300 people sat completely still. Even the floor crew, who had seen everything in 20 years of live television, went quiet. Then Audrey Hepburn spoke, not the rehearsed, careful voice she used for interviews, but something raw, something that had clearly been waiting a very long time to be heard. "I believed him," she said quietly. "For years, I believed every word he said." 18 million viewers watched it happen in real time. By the next morning, NBC's switchboard had more calls than it had received since the moon landing. Critics would later call it the most unguarded moment in the history of American television. But none of them knew, not the audience, not the critics, not even Carson's producers, what question had actually unlocked it. That moment didn't start there. To understand what broke Audrey Hepburn on a Tuesday night in 1979, you have to go back 25 years, to a woman who fell in love with the wrong man at exactly the right moment in her life and spent 14 years paying for it in silence. Her name before the world knew it was Etta van Heemstra Hepburn Rustin. She was born in Brussels in 1929, the daughter of a Dutch baroness and a British banker, and she spent her childhood being quietly dismantled by history. When the Nazis occupied Arnhem during the Second World War, Audrey was 11 years old. She watched her uncle executed. She ate tulip bulbs to survive. She danced in secret performances with the curtains drawn so the soldiers outside wouldn't hear the music. Those years did something to her that no amount of fame or elegance ever fully reversed. They taught her that the most dangerous thing a person could do was need something too much. Need food, need safety, need love. Need was what got people killed. By 1953, she was 24 years old and the most sought-after young actress in Hollywood, having just won an Academy Award for Roman Holiday in her first major film role. The world saw radiance. What the world did not see was a young woman who was profoundly uncertain about whether she deserved any of it. A woman who still flinched at loud noises, who ate very little, who worked herself to exhaustion rather than sit still long enough to feel afraid. That was the year she met Mel Ferrer. He was 12 years older than her, an actor and director with sharp eyes and a sharper instinct for other people's insecurities. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, precisely and deliberately, like a key cut for a specific lock. Audrey, who had spent her childhood learning not to need anything, found herself needing him almost immediately. He was confident where she was uncertain. He was certain where she was lost. And he told her, in the particular way that controlling people always do, that he understood her better than anyone else ever could. They married in September 1954. She was 25, he was 37. And from the very first year, the marriage operated on a principle Audrey would not name for another 25 years. That her success was a problem requiring his management, and that her failures, including the 2 miscarriages that nearly destroyed her, were somehow connected to the ambition he had decided was her flaw. But in 1954, she believed he loved her, And that belief, more than anything else, is what made the next 14 years possible. By 1968, the marriage was over in everything but paperwork. Audrey filed for divorce quietly, the way she did most painful things, without drama, without public statement, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her bleed. The official reason given to the press was incompatibility. It was the most expensive understatement of her life. She retreated to Switzerland with her son Sean, then 8 years old, and did something that surprised everyone who thought they knew her. She stopped working. For nearly a decade, Audrey Hepburn, the woman who had defined Hollywood elegance for an entire generation, simply disappeared from screens. The offers came. She declined them all. People assumed it was a lifestyle choice, a woman choosing family over career. What it actually was someone trying to locate herself after 14 years of being told she was lost. The problem was that Mel Ferrer's voice didn't leave when he did. That is the particular cruelty of a certain kind of marriage. The person goes, but the damage stays, fluent and persistent, sounding exactly like your own thoughts. Audrey had been told so many times, in so many careful and reasonable-sounding ways, that her miscarriages were the consequence of caring too much about her career, that her instincts were unreliable, that her judgment needed his correction, that by the time the divorce was final, she had genuinely lost the ability to separate his assessments of her from her own. She remarried in 1969. Andrea Dotti was an Italian psychiatrist, warm and sociable, where Mel had been cold and controlling. For a while, it felt like recovery. She had a second son, Luca. She baked, she gardened. She told interviewers she was happy and largely believed it. But the marriage slowly revealed its own fault lines, and by the late 1970s, Audrey was once again living inside a life that looked better from the outside than it felt from the inside. It was in this condition, quietly fractured, carefully composed, carrying 14 years of one marriage and a failing second, that she agreed to appear on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in the spring of 1979. The stated purpose was to discuss her work with UNICEF. She had prepared for exactly that conversation and nothing else. Carson had prepared for something else entirely. The first 20 minutes of the interview went exactly as Audrey had planned. Carson asked about UNICEF. She spoke about the children she had visited in Ethiopia and Turkey, about malnutrition, about what it meant to look into the face of a child who had given up expecting anything from the world. She was articulate and passionate and perfectly controlled. The audience loved her. The cameras loved her. Everything was proceeding along the careful track she had laid for herself. Then Carson set down his index cards. It was a small gesture, barely visible, but television veterans in the audience recognized it immediately. It meant he was going off script. His producer in the booth saw it and reached instinctively for his headset. Carson's sideman, Ed McMahon, who had watched Johnny conduct 10,000 interviews, straightened slightly in his chair. Carson looked at Audrey for a moment without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "Audrey, I have to ask you something, and I want you to know you don't have to answer it." She nodded once, still composed, still behind the glass of her own elegance. "Did Mel ever tell you that losing those babies was your fault?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. It was measured later, frame by frame, by a researcher writing about the interview for a broadcasting journal. 4 seconds of complete silence on live American television, which is an eternity, which is long enough for 18 million people to lean forward without knowing they are doing it. Then something moved across Audrey Hepburn's face that had no name in the vocabulary of her public life. It was not sadness exactly, it was recognition, the specific expression of a person hearing a truth spoken aloud for the first time, a truth they have been carrying so long and so privately that hearing it in another person's voice feels like being struck and relieved simultaneously. She could have deflected. She had the skill and the training and 40 years of practice at giving interviewers exactly what they needed without giving them anything real. She made a different choice. "Yes," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He did, and I believed him. For years, I believed every word he said." She did not look away from Carson. She did not reach for composure. For the first time in her public life, Audrey Hepburn let herself be seen without the performance. And what was there, underneath all that elegance, was a woman who had been quietly breaking for a very long time. Carson didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her hand or signal the floor director or do any of the things that television instinct would normally demand in a moment of visible distress. He simply stayed where he was and let the silence hold her, which was the greatest kindness he could have offered. The understanding that she didn't need to be rescued, she needed to be witnessed. Audrey wiped her eyes once with the back of her hand and then straightened, not into the old composure, but into something newer and less armored. She began to talk, not in the careful, curated way she had talked for 40 years, but in the way of someone who has just put down something very heavy and feels, for the first time, the strange lightness of empty hands. She told Carson that the miscarriages, there had been 2 during the marriage to Mel and a 3rd attempt that failed, had been the most devastating experiences of her life. She told him that Mel had never raised his voice, had never been cruel in any way that left marks, but that he had a gift for making her feel that her body's failures were connected to her character's failures. That wanting a career and wanting a child at the same time was a kind of greed the universe was correcting. She had been 27 years old the first time she lost a pregnancy. She had believed him. The audience sat completely still through all of it. Not the polite stillness of people being respectful, but the involuntary stillness of people who have forgotten to breathe. When she finished, Carson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know that wasn't true. None of it was true." "I know that now," Audrey said. "It took me a very long time." What happened to Audrey Hepburn in the months after that interview, according to the people closest to her, was not dramatic or sudden. It was gradual and quiet, the way real transformation usually is. She began speaking to her son Sean about the marriage in ways she never had before. She stopped apologizing for the years she had spent away from film. She threw herself into UNICEF work with a focus that her colleagues described as newly purposeful, as though she had finally identified what the work was actually for. She had spent 25 years carrying a verdict that was never true. She had 4 years left to live without it. The broadcast aired on a Thursday. By Friday morning, NBC's switchboard had logged more than 40,000 calls. Not the usual volume of viewer complaints or fan enthusiasm, something different, something the network's operators had rarely encountered. People were calling to share their own stories. Women who had never told anyone about marriages that had quietly diminished them. Men who had carried private verdicts about their own failures for decades. Adult children who recognized in Audrey's description of Mel Ferrer something they had witnessed in their own homes and never had the language for. The letters came for weeks. Audrey read them personally, according to her assistant at the time. She responded to as many as she could, in her own handwriting, on plain notepaper. Not form letters, not publicist-drafted acknowledgments, her own words, to strangers who had trusted her with theirs. Carson spoke about the interview privately to colleagues for years afterward. He had conducted thousands of conversations across 3 decades of television, had sat across from presidents and poets and criminals and saints, and he told his producer Fred de Cordova that the 7 minutes after he set down his index cards that night were the most important 7 minutes of his broadcasting career. Not because of what was revealed about Audrey Hepburn specifically, but because of what happened in living rooms across America while it was happening. The quiet recognition, the exhaled breath, the feeling of a truth being named that had been living unnamed in millions of private lives. The clip was not replayed extensively in the years that followed. This was 1979, before the architecture of viral media existed, before a moment like that could be shared and reshared until it lost its texture. It lived instead in the memories of the people who had watched it in real time, which meant it retained something that most television moments do not. It remained personal. People did not remember it as a famous clip. They remembered where they were sitting when they saw it. Audrey Hepburn left the NBC studio that night with her assistant and drove back to her hotel without stopping. She did not give additional interviews about the conversation. She did not leverage the moment into a memoir, or a talk circuit, or a public identity built on survivorship. She simply went back to her life. Except that the life she went back to was, by every account of those who knew her, measurably lighter than the one she had carried in. Audrey Hepburn died on January 20th, 1993, in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, in the house she had made her refuge from everything the world had asked her to be. She was 63 years old. The cancer had moved quickly, the way it sometimes does with people who don't make a fuss, and she spent her final weeks surrounded by her sons, by Robert Wolders, the man who had loved her without condition for the last years of her life, and by the particular quiet of a woman who had, somewhere along the way, made her peace. The tributes that followed were what you would expect. The film retrospectives, the fashion tributes, the inevitable replaying of the Breakfast at Tiffany's footage and the Roman holiday footage, and the photographs of her in Givenchy that had defined an entire aesthetic era. The world mourned the icon it had constructed, which was real enough, but which was only one version of her. The other version, the one that had sat across from Johnny Carson on a Thursday night in 1979 and said, yes, he told me it was my fault, and I believed him. That version was quieter and more durable, and for the people who had witnessed it, far more important. Because that version was not about elegance or style or the particular angle of a cheekbone in black and white. That version was about what it costs a person to carry a lie they have been given by someone who claimed to love them, and what it feels like after years and years to finally set it down. Audrey Hepburn spent her career playing women who were discovering the world. She spent her private life discovering herself, which is a slower and less cinematic process, and one that does not always resolve neatly before the credits roll. But it did resolve. That is the thing worth remembering. It resolved. She got there. Quietly, without announcement, in her own time and on her own terms, the way she had always done everything that actually mattered to her. If someone in your life is carrying something they were told about themselves that was never true, share this story with them. And if that person is you, if you have been living inside a verdict someone else wrote, remember that Audrey Hepburn believed hers for 25 years and still found her way out. Subscribe for more stories about the moments that made legends human.